This is KKSU-LD, broadcasting in high definition from Kansas State University, covering Manhattan, Riley County, and the Flint Hills. You're watching Channel 8 News.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Channel 8 News. I'm Eden Brockman. One of the biggest issues for Americans and Kansans is political polarization. We wanted to see how the rise of political polarization affects the newest generation of voters in Kansas and how democracy and polarization look globally. We talked with young people, experts on the issue, and international PhD-seeking students to learn more. The term political polarization encompasses many different ways that people are pulling to each side of the political spectrum. Dr. Colleen Lind has done a lot of research on the political decision-making process. She said in one dimension of polarization, called affective polarization, scholars found people's emotions towards the political party they do not identify with have increasingly become more negative.
As evidenced by things like survey responses that says, how disappointed would you be if your son or daughter married someone of the other political party? Over time, people have responded to that in more and more polarized ways, saying I would be more and more disappointed if they married someone that way. But we can also talk about partisan polarization. So that's sort of what we might think of as cleansing within the parties. So traditionally, Democrats would have a range of political ideologies, from liberal to conservative. Republicans would have a range of political ideologies, from liberal to conservative. But over about the last 30 years, we've seen this sorting within the parties so that Democrats are by and large mostly liberal, Republicans by and large are mostly conservative.
Dr. Raluca Cosma specializes in journalism and international political communication at Kansas State University. She explains that Kansas does not always follow the national trends.
Politically polarized society, we're kind of a unique example here, right? Because I think this can happen in a Midwestern agricultural society, right, where you have men and women working side by side, and we have a female Democrat governor, right, in a state where the majority of politicians are Republicans. So I think people vote on the issues more so than, on gender or ideology. So just inform yourself on the issues and see where your interests lie and vote accordingly, right? But you have to inform yourself on those. Mm-hmm. So yes, there's more polarization than ever, but at the same time, there are examples where Kansans, right, they look at the issues and they don't fall into a pattern necessarily. And we also saw with the special election too, right, where we have major turnout in a midterm election, which we haven't seen in the past.
As for Generation Z, Dr. Lind says that their voting tendencies are still up for debate, but they have already proven to be politically active.
It seems fairly clear that Gen Z, despite the fact that they feel rather pessimistic about the future of the country and the ability of politics to make any difference or positive change, they nevertheless tend to get involved.
We wanted to see how the rise of political polarization affects the newest generation of voters. We talked with different clubs, classrooms, and organizations and gathered 16 participants of evenly spread political ideologies. Of the 16 Gen Zers who committed to the study, 9 participated, including 5 Democrats, 2 Republicans, 1 independent, and 1 undecided. In a pre-event survey, some participants expressed a little nervousness about the process, with responses like, quote, I am curious to see if other people will disagree with me because I feel like my opinions are different compared to most of the students here, end quote. And quote, this is definitely out of my comfort zone, but I am excited, end quote. And then lastly, quote, I am very nervous, but excited at the same time. I have never been a part of something like this before, end quote. Participants heard a series of statements about political polarization and were asked to walk to a line indicating how much they agreed with the statement. The different lines represented if they agreed, somewhat agreed, remained neutral, somewhat disagreed, or disagreed with the statement. America is polarized politically. The yellow dot represents our independent participant. The green dot represents our undecided participant, and the blue dot represents the Democrat participants, while the red dot represents the Republican participants. The participants almost unanimously agreed with this statement.
Well, I mean, people don't, split their tickets anymore either. It used to be, a lot of the times you vote for Republican on top of the ballot, and then you vote for Democrat for Senate, and you kind of have those inverted delegations and stuff, but you don't see that anymore.
I am an open-minded person. Again, most participants agreed that they were open-minded.
Yeah, I would just say it would be easier if everyone could just try to keep an open mind. It's easier said than done, but at the end of the day, I think it's more beneficial to listen and try to hear what they're saying, and that does not mean you have to change your views or anything, but I just feel like instead of I feel like people try to, in a way, like attack the other person, even if they don't mean it, but it's just like they're trying to benefit themselves, being like, oh no, I'm right, you're wrong, and I don't think it should be like that because everyone's valid to their own opinion.
My political beliefs are considered extreme in our society. While most did not feel this way, one participant who identifies as a Republican felt like an outlier.
Yeah, it was awkward. There's, I think, one I was unagree with. Do you think people view your beliefs as extreme? So that one was kind of a more loaded question type of thing, or people would think about you based on where you were on that question in particular. So that was one that stuck out to me of being like an outlier.
I could see myself voting for someone from the opposite political party one day. Participants were split on this statement, with Republicans leaning towards disagree and Democrats were split between somewhat agree and disagree. The independent and undecided voters remained neutral. All of our participants felt neutral or agreed with the statement about being open-minded. Can people be open-minded if they could never see themselves voting for someone in a different political party than them? Well, that is for you to decide. Up next, we hear from the participants about how they deal with misinformation and other issues facing Generation Z. Welcome back. We've seen a little about our participants' answers. We then had a chance to sit down with those who were part of the study. Participants got into groups of 3 and talked about political polarization, their politics, and the current issues facing Generation Z. Is Generation Z more or less polarized than older generations?
I would honestly say that our generation is not as polarized. I would say we are just talking about the polarization that we've seen in other generations more than the past. So I feel like there's just more communication there.
More. But I don't think it's because we're doing it on purpose or they're doing it on purpose. It's just we were raised in a completely different world with phones and 24-hour news cycle and than other generations. So
I think it's definitely what is more like put out there into the world, but I think like in general most people fall within like this middle area. But I think like what you hear about on TV and in the news is like both sides, like the polarization. So I think it's like prevalent, but I think it's definitely not the majority of people.
What issues are most important to Generation Z students? In all 3 groups, participants discussed social media as being one of the top issues facing Generation Z currently.
I think to an extent social media doesn't help. Like we're shown what we want to see and we're shown what we believe. So, for whatever side you're on, that's what you're seeing and that's the content that you're taking in. So it's kind of tough to kind of be neutral when you're seeing so much negative on the other side or so much positives on your side.
Another participant cited censorship on social media as being the biggest issue.
There's a big problem with censorship, in my opinion, and that's kind of, as far as polarization, maybe working with that, like creating echo chambers. People will get kicked off of like the major platforms where they were having like a discourse, and then they'll just have to make their own or find some other spot on like the internet where there's maybe only people that believe similar things to them. They'll just be kind of stuck talking to those people. So yeah, I think that, I guess, hearing the other side or being able to tell your ideas to the other side in like the digital public square, as it were, like Twitter and stuff, is very important.
Participants Michael and Peyton disagreed on if politics are personal or just policy-based.
Politics should not be personal. It should be policy-based. When you're talking about these issues, and there's no need to bring, personal attacks into it. But I mean, it's only getting worse. I don't even know if there's really a remedy to it. But I don't know. I think the main thing people should know is that politics, when you're talking about it, shouldn't be personal. It throws everyone off on the wrong track.
I will say that obviously personal attacks is not okay when you're talking to somebody, but sometimes politics is personal because it affects personally what is going to happen to you sometimes. And so I think, acknowledging that and acknowledging that, hey, this policy is going to affect me in a completely different way than it's going to affect some people. So I agree with the personal attacks, absolutely, but sometimes politics is personal.
Chris, a participant in the study, said listening to understand rather than listening to respond will help people have the necessary conversations to create progress.
Right. Everybody's seen life from different walks, different aspects and what that looks like, right? My experiences as a Black man in America are going to be completely different from anybody else in America because we're different individuals and we see life and experience life in different ways. So with that being said, privileges that others may be entitled to, I am not. So that helps sway my opinions and my outlooks. But in order for us to have that educated conversation, in order for us to, again, push the needle on what needs to happen in this country, that piece of listening to understand as opposed to listening to criticize and ridicule and belittle has to stop.
We've looked at Generation Z in the United States, but how does our democracy look from the outside looking in? Coming up, we will talk to some international students about the difference between our democracy and other countries. We have looked at American political polarization through the eyes of Generation Z and experts on the issue. And now we are going to sit down and discuss polarization as well as democracy through a global lens. With us, we have originally from the Ivory Coast, Innocent Asuman. And then from India, we have Ritu Prasad. And from South Africa, we have Iswa, or Z for short. And would you like to introduce yourself for us?
Yes, I am Soma Kashalala. You may call me Exi. I'm from South Africa.
Perfect. Thank you all so much for coming and talking with me today. So to start off, we recently have had an election here in the U.S. So how do you perceive the United States government system compared to your home country? And then Exi, would you like to start us off?
Yes. So growing up in South Africa and watching American news and the American voting, it has always been thought to be the most democratic, the most free world. And I envied American democracy. But now that I'm here and I got to watch as the elections were ongoing and what people were saying, it surprised me how, one, young people are not voting. Yeah.
And it's interesting that you say that because we actually had a bigger Generation Z turnout in this election than we haven't had in the past. It was around 25%. So would you say younger people in South Africa tend to vote more than young people here?
Yes, our democracy is very young. It is 28 years old. Yeah, we just got our democracy in 1994. So voting is one of the things that Black people could not do before 1994. So we still have that in mind. We still have the privilege, like we can still see what a privilege it is to vote. So people really do turn out to vote.
Ritu, how would you say that comparison looks with India?
So I would say in what I feel or what I have seen, the US democracy is representation of majorly two parties, Democrats and Republican, whereas we in India, the representation of democracy is parliamentary, where it's not that two parties are running the country, like contest is between two parties, not at all. we have many regional parties and they are the big player. So that's the one difference, major difference between America and Indian politics. So in India, the regional players are equally forceful and they kind of decide the politics of India. That's the interesting fact about Indian democracy.
Innocent, I wanted to ask you, how do you think your worldview, coming from the Ivory Coast to the U.S., how do you think your worldview helps you lessen polarization or see some of those different sides? What is, if that makes sense? Yeah.
Yes, it does. Thank you for the question. Actually, I think getting the opportunity to be exposed to different contexts, like my country, and I also get the opportunity to visit other countries in Africa before coming here, it helped me to always try to caution myself. Like, do I think that what I see is the truth? So I start questioning truth. I start questioning ideologies. I start questioning concepts. So like even when we use the word democracy, for instance, I think the exposure switched my understanding and my perception about democracy. And today I do believe that democracy should be contextualized. It doesn't have to be a kind of copy and paste. Like democracy that can work in the American context, I'm not sure that can work in my country, Cote d'Ivoire. It can't work in our context. Why? Because we do have some cultural values, some knowledge that they qualify as indigenous knowledge, which is part of our cultural identity that we cannot build democracy beyond. What I'm trying to say here, an example will be in my country and most of the West African country, we have a traditional structure that we rule under kingdomship. And those traditional people have power and it is symbolic. So in a rural community, we have a king and the king has under like his supervision some elders. So whenever there is a decision at a state level, the king can decide that this decision we are abiding to it or not. And so I think these are some of the layers when they are talking about democracy in our context. So in order to think about how we can incorporate those kind of knowledge in our new way to institutionalize democracy, in my country, initially they were excluding them. And they qualify them as this is indigenous. And we are in a modern time where we need new perception. But today, because the country was hit by two political crises in 2002 and 2010. So after that, the new government has decided and they have understood the power of those kings. So today they are institutionalized, the kingdoms. And so I think this is a way to see how we can formalize or frame a new kind of democracy in the African context, like in my country. So when I come here and I hear about democracy, I think things are actually different. Why? Because I do still believe, even though we talk about technology, US is a developed country, I do believe that within rural communities, we do still have people who knows the history, who are culturally embedded. And oftentimes they call those people as maybe conservatives. How often do we open the door for them to hear their voice, to understand what they think about, and what is the perception about the new decisions that we are making? So I think there is always room for improvement in how we frame democracy globally.
Thank you all so much for coming. Innocent, Ritu, and Exie, thank you so much for talking with me today. Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you
so
for having
much
us.
Thank you.
for having us.
Thank you.
Coming up, we'll take a look at the future for Generation Z and political polarization and advice from Dr. Raluca Cosma and Colleen Lind on how to have productive civil discourse. So where are we going? In the November 2022 election, voters seem to vote against extremes and more towards moderation and balance. As citizens, what should we do to minimize polarization and be open-minded? Dr. Raluca Cosma encourages people to engage in healthy debate.
Because it's okay to disagree, but disagree on the issues, don't attack the person, don't resort to disparaging comments about a party you disagree with, don't resort to uncivil discourse, don't do ad hominem attacks, right? Talk about the issue and try to understand where they come from, finding common ground, because we really are united by more things than are divided by in our humanity, right? And our interests. We all want to be happy and our families to do well, right? We really have very common goals, right? And we want to leave this society in better shape than we found it for our children. So I think there are a lot of issues we actually agree on.
Dr. Lind encourages people to go to the polls and cast their votes and to run for office.
We also need younger people to run for office in order for them to be elected. Let me tell you a quick narrative about women in politics. One of the things that we've learned fairly definitively about women and service in politics is that, with some exceptions, generally they are not underrepresented because the electorate won't vote for them. They're underrepresented because they're less likely to run in the first place. I wonder if the same isn't true for younger political candidates. I have to think that they have just as good a chance of getting elected if they're solid candidates. The problem is they're not as likely to run. So I would encourage Gen Zers to think about whether or not they don't need to wait until the perfect time of their life to throw their hat in the ring for local races. You know, it doesn't even have to be a state legislative or national race. Start in your local community, running for local office.
Thanks for joining us for this Channel 8 News special report on political polarization in Kansas. I'm Eden Brockman. Be on the lookout for more Channel 8 news in the upcoming year.
This is Channel 8 News.